Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. I want to wish all my Israeli friends, all my Israeli viewers, the people that are Israeli that I know, a happy Independence Day. This, of course, the independence of Israel from the British Mandate, which was established in 1918 after World War One and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. After that, of course, Israel went into a mandated period in which they were indirectly under British control. And then in 1948, David Ben Gurion, the first prime minister of Israel, got on the podium with the picture of Theodore Herzl, the father of modern intellectual Zionism, in the background, and declared that Israel, for the first time in 2,000 years, was an independent country, and for the first time ever, was an independent republic. Of course, this coming on the heels of the year before the United Nations declaring that Israel, um, you know, had the right to form, and then proposing a split between the Arab population in Palestine, in British mandated Palestine, and the Jewish population. And of course, coming on the heels of the 1917 resolution, the Balfour Declaration, which declared Britain's intention to do so, which is one of the reasons why Britain entered into World War I against the Ottomans, of course. So this was a very historic thing because, like I said, Israel have not there have been no such thing as Israel for 2,000 years. Since um, the exile of the Jews and the destruction of the Second Temple, coming with um, in 70 AD, and then the Bar Kokhba revolt years later. The Jews have been exiled and they've been living under different different empires. They were living under the Byzantines, the Umayyads, the Abbasids, the Crusaders, the Ayyubids, the Mamluks, and then finally the Ottomans, and then the British. Now, um, the Jews were resettled back in their ancient homeland according to them, according to their religion, and they declared um, themselves an independent state with the Hebrew language reestablished. Now, of course, we're going to say, well, there is some controversy there because people say, well, they aren't the real quote unquote Jews, they're European settlers, which I'm not going to get into all of that. That's not the point of this video. I have other videos expressing my viewpoints of that. But the point is, the day was May 14th, 1948, when this happened. But of course, the Jewish calendar is lunar. The Jewish calendar is not solar like our calendar in Christian society. So, being as though it's lunar, it falls on different days. So, the Jewish month of Iyar, the third of the fourth of Iyar, is when uh, this day is. So it falls on different days each year, but today it falls on May the 4th and 5th. So we talked yesterday about Star Wars, and of course, you can't mention Star Wars without mentioning Natalie Portman, who was an Israeli national, a Sabra, what they call a Sabra, a person that was uh, native, a native born Israeli, from Israeli stock, was born in Israel. You know what I mean? So, of course, then Gal Gadot. You know what I mean? People say Gal Gadot, but it makes it sound more French than Israeli. But those are two famous Israelis around the world that we know about. That many people know. And of course, May 14th for Palestinian people, Palestinians, people of Palestinian descent, is a different day. It is what's called Nakba Day. And I just feel like, yeah, okay, raining on their parade, but you cannot ever mention anything having to do with Israel without also mentioning the Arab and Palestinian population and vice versa, because their histories are so inexplicably tied together. Like their nationalisms came at the exact same time. They were both promised something under the British. The the Palestinians, especially uh, the Sharif of Mecca at that time, the Sharif Husseini, was promised something different in the his Hussein McMahon correspondence in 1915 than what Lord Belfer had promised the first president of Israel, Chaim Weizmann, in 1917. So you can't mention one without mentioning the other, so I had to really mention that. And of course, after this, the Arab countries they didn't accept partition on the part of the United Nations, and they did not accept the Declaration of Israeli Independence on this day. They went to war, and Israel overcame the odds and defeated all the Arab countries for the first time ever in 48. That was, of course, um, the war that the infamous Deir Yassin incident or Deir Yassin massacre happened on April the 9th, which Palestinians were emptied out of all their villages, and that's when the exile of Palestinians really began. Not in the 6 Day War, like a lot of people think, oh, that happened in a 6 Day War. But anyway, that's not the point of this video. But happy Independence Day to Israelis. I find it kind of weird that it's kind of like American 4th of July. They have barbecues, they have fireworks, all that kind of stuff. They have their Memorial Day the day before, and then after that they have their Independence Day, and they have like these Bible reading contests because, of course, the Bible is linked to the history of not only Israelis but the entirety of the Jewish people as a whole. So, very controversial day and really a very controversial issue when it comes to Zionism and the law of return with regards to the Jewish people and the right of return with regards to Palestinian refugees in the 48 war. So, and of course, it's an issue that we cover a lot on this channel because I feel like, from a fair perspective, I've known both Israelis, people of Israeli descent, Israeli Sabras, and Jewish people in the Jewish diaspora, a lot of Jewish people, and I've known a lot of course, Muslims, even Muslims who are not Palestinian descent, have a very strong connection to this part of the land, just like Christians, because of religion. Jerusalem is the holiest site, third holiest site in um, Islam, and the holiest site in Judaism and Christianity. So all three religions that predominate the world, the three predominant religions in the world, especially the Western world where I live, and I've been involved with all three at various points, either involved with myself through a cultural heritage, of course, Christianity, Catholicism coming from my background, and Islam coming from my background as well, and just really sympathizing and understanding trying to understand anyway, the entire picture. I don't uh, take sides in this. I think, yeah, um, there's a there's a historically legitimate claim for both peoples and both nations, and I find it a very interesting topic to cover and um, issue to talk about. One of the best books I've ever read on it is Enemies and Neighbors. Um, Enemies and Neighbors by Ian Black, not the Ian Black from the 90s retrospectives. I love the 90s on VH1, but a different Ian Black is uh, the author of this book, and this is a very interesting book because it traces the struggle between not only Israelis and Palestinians, but Jews and Arabs before that, all the way from uh, the time even before the dissolution of the Ottoman Empire, when Theodore Herzl founds Zionism in the 1890s and confronts the Turkish Sultan at that time, Abdul Hamid II. You know what I mean? To the present day, which the book was written in 2017. So it doesn't cover uh, Trump's movement or Trump's movement of um, the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, but it does cover every other period when the Nazis, for example, bombed Tel Aviv during Second World War, which we don't really hear about. Um, the Hashomer um, group or faction of Israelis that kind of reminded me of cowboys. And as I'm listening to it, I'm seeing a lot of analogies drawn between what I know about American history and the settlement of the West and Manifest Destiny and what Zionism was. And it kind of all made sense to me, other than the strategic alliances between Israel and the United States. You know, during the Cold War, Israel was an ally of the United States against Soviet backed regimes like Gamal Abdel Nasser, or now that the Palestinians might, be connected with either Hamas or Hezbollah or some kind of Islamist thing that is against the United States, some kind of Islamist entity that is against the United States. It all made sense to me, like not only from a geopolitical standpoint, but even from a cultural standpoint, that the United States would see themselves in Israel, kind of, because their histories are kind of parallel. You know what I mean? Both in the good and the bad. You know, their aspirations, their focus on Western culture, their emulation in terms of the constitutional republicanism, their focus on democracy, and also the bad parts of it, the way that Native Americans, for example, were treated here in the United States during Manifest Destiny, kind of parallels how Palestinians were treated um, during the settlement of uh, Israel in the late 18th century and the late 19th century and the early 20th century. You know, kind of always pushing them back and pushing them, putting them somewhere and then pushing them back, putting them, for example, Trail of Tears, 1830s, and then pushing them back with further westward expansion, in the latter half of the 19th century, just like with Israelis. Okay, they made this deal with Jordan. Now Jordan is the recognized Arab state. Then they have the war in '67, and they push the Palestinians further back because Israel then takes over the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. You know what I'm saying? So I saw a lot of historical parallels between that. Both motivated by a sort of religious ideology, this ideology to create a new Jerusalem in what is Israel, the old Jerusalem, and what is America, the New Jerusalem. And this idea that the founders were exiled from Europe and that they were wronged and that they were marginalized, so they came over here, just like with the Pilgrims. They came over here to set up a more equitable society, but it didn't inevitably happen. There was culture clashes between the people that were already here versus the people that were, that came over. You know, like the Indians were already here, but European settlers came over and moved them out and moved them out, and continued to move them out further west until the United States controlled it all. And the same thing was true with Israel. Israel came in. Initially, they had peace with the Palestinians, they had peace with the Arabs, and they coexisted with the Arabs. But then, over time, they continued to be politically motivated by their political ideology, which was Zionism, and they felt they were right, and they pushed the Arabs further and further until now The Arabs slash Palestinians are exactly where they are. The only kind of difference was the Arabs already had a civilization. They had hundreds and thousands of years, um, set up multiple empires, and they themselves had come in the seventh century with the spread of Islam and taken over the land from like the Byzantines and other groups, and they Arabized the population. So it wasn't like, and they still had some cohesiveness. They still had some ability to come together, some source of unity, which was Islam or the Arab culture, which the Native Americans did not have that. You know what I mean? The Native Americans never really had unity amongst each other in their abilities to fight the European settlers in the United States, whereas the Palestinians and the Arabs, well, especially the Palestinians, not really the Arabs, because the Arab states, they were different states. They were different, motivated by nationalism to do something different. And that was one of the reasons why they lost in both those wars, because they really couldn't coexist. So they had a certain level more cohesiveness than the Native Americans, but not so much cohesiveness that they could overcome it, you know. But there is that aspect of ignorance, that the Israeli settlers had, because let's face it, they came up with this saying. Well, Lord Ashbury, one of the British early Zionists, actually came up with this uh, land for a people. I mean, a people without a land for a land without a people. I mean, a land without a people for a people without a land, and that wasn't true. Palestine had a people. It wasn't a federal state. It wasn't a nation state. Sure, no nation state in Palestine ever existed, but it was a part of southern Syria. It was governed for years in various empires as Syria. It was a part of Greater Syria. Even the Romans divided Palestine into like three Palestines. The Judea, and Samaria. They weren't the only Palestines. There is deep, there's deep conflict between these various nations, but these various positions. But anyway, happy Israeli Independence Day. Peace. Don't forget to like and subscribe.